She recorded an old man's war stories for school, but his final story made her sob. The first time Claire heard Mr. Harold speak of war, she thought it sounded like a movie. The second time, she saw the tremor in his hand and realized it was something far too real. Claire Mason never expected her senior project to turn into something that would change her. All she needed was a human interest story, a recorded oral history of someone's life, and when her history teacher handed her the name Harold Green, she barely blinked. World War II vet. Lives at Willow Pines Care Home. Decorated, but kind of a recluse, her teacher had said. Be polite. Be patient. And record everything. Willow Pines smelled like antiseptic and boiled peas. The halls echoed with the shuffle of slippers and wheeled walkers. Claire, with her oversized headphones and pocket-sized mic recorder, felt like a trespasser in a forgotten world. Harold Green was sitting by the window when she found him. Sunlight poured over his white hair, and his eyes sharp and gray fixed on her before she even spoke. "You the girl with the tape machine?" he asked, voice gravelly but firm. "Yes, sir," Claire replied. "Claire Mason. I'm here to interview you if that's okay." He studied her. "Only if you're not going to ask about medals and glory. We're ain't a Hollywood script." "I won't," she promised. And she didn't. Not at first. The first story he told was about his brother, killed in North Africa. "I was 18 when the telegram came. My mother made no sound. Just stood there in the kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, until the soup boiled over." Claire wrote that down in her notebook later that night. Until the soup boiled over. It was the kind of detail you couldn't make up. The second day, Harold spoke about his time in Italy. Not the battles, but the waiting. The men sleeping with their boots on. The smell of the rain mixing with blood and diesel. The way they kept old photographs in their helmet liners, praying the faces wouldn't fade. Every afternoon for a week, Claire returned to that window-lit room, sat opposite the old soldier, and pressed record. But on the seventh day, Harold was silent. He stared at the mic. "You want the last story?" he said quietly. "The one no one hears." Claire blinked. "Only if you want to tell it." He nodded. Once. Slowly. Then turned the thing on. "But no, it's not about a gunfight. It's about a promise." Act 2. The final story. Harold began with a name. Benjamin Sorensen. He was my best friend. Grew up 3 farms over in Kansas. Joined up the same week as me. He was loud. Always singing. And brave as hell. Claire watched the lines in his face deepen as he spoke. We ended up in the same unit. Normandy, then Holland. Winter of 44, near Bastogne. That's when it happened. He swallowed. We were told to hold a ridge. Freezing, foggy, snow up to your knees. We dug in. Didn't sleep. Then the shelling started. Harold paused. Closed his eyes. I still remember the sound like the sky ripping in half. Ben got hit. Shrapnel tore through his side. Claire's breath caught in her throat. I dragged him into a crater. He was bleeding out. Cold. Shaking. But he smiled at me. Said, "Tell my mama I wasn't scared." Then gave me something. Harold's hand moved to his pocket, trembling. He handed me a letter. Said, "Don't read it. Just make sure it gets home." Claire leaned forward. "Did you deliver it?" "I tried," Harold whispered. War ended 3 months later. I came back. Went to his parents' farm. But the house was gone. Torn down. Land sold. His family gone. I tried everything. Years. Letters. Archives. Claire's eyes widened. "You never found them?" "No," Harold looked at her. His eyes were glassy. "I failed him." Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered envelope sealed, but smudged and cracked with age. "I still have it. Still haven't opened it. After all these years." Claire's fingers tingled. She didn't speak. She didn't dare. "I want you to have it," Harold said, placing the envelope on the table between them. "Maybe you can do what I couldn't." The recorder clicked off as Harold's trembling hand released the envelope. Silence descended for an eternity before Claire dared to speak. Her throat was parched as she whispered, "Sir, what do you want me to do with it?" His eyes, swirling with memories too painful to name, met hers. "You are young," he murmured, voice raw with regret and hope. "But you have time. I was given a promise many decades ago, a promise I never kept. Now, I lean on you to finish what I started." A chill shivered down Claire's spine. In that moment, the weight of his unsaid words pressed upon her like a winter storm. With trembling fingers, she reached for the envelope. The paper was brittle and yellowed, its edges soft as memories of a forgotten era. She did not open it yet. Instead, She tucked it close within the confines of her recorder bag, as if preserving not just a physical artifact, but a sacred trust. Over the following days, each session with Harold became a pilgrimage into both history and the frailties of the human heart. She listened as he recounted a tapestry of moments from battlefields and tender recollections back home. The stories twisted between valor and vulnerability, between glory and grief. It was as if every word he spoke was a fragment of a soul weighed down by burdens too heavy to bear alone. Harold spoke often of Benjamin, his best friend whose laughter once filled the tent during long, bitter nights. In his recollection, Benjamin was more than a soldier. He was the embodiment of hope amidst despair. One snowy evening in the barracks, amidst whispers of home and dreams yet to come, Benjamin had taken out a small scrap of paper from his pocket. "This is for when all the smoke clears," he had declared, his voice a beacon of defiance in the howling wind. He then scribbled something in a shaky hand and passed it to Harold with a conspiratorial grin. Harold had laughed, dismissing it as a child's scribble. But as time marched on and the cruel hands of fate claimed Benjamin, that fragile note transformed into a symbol of promises broken and love unfulfilled. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the golden leaves danced outside the window, Harold confided a memory that made Claire's heart contract painfully. "After the battle, I stayed by Benjamin's side. I held his hand as his eyes slowly dimmed. Even then, he whispered that our war was not just against an enemy, but against the despair of our own hearts." His voice wavered as though each word were a needle pricking old wounds. "I promised him, if I ever lived to see peace, I would ensure that his family knew his last words, his final message of hope." That promise haunted him like a specter. For decades, Harold wandered through administrative mazes and bureaucratic dead ends, searching for a trace of Benjamin's kin. The letter, always sealed and never opened, became his talisman of regret. It was a secret locked away behind the fragile barrier of paper, a secret that contained the very essence of his unresolved grief and unkept promises. On one rainy afternoon, with gray skies reflecting the tumult within his eyes, Harold asked Claire to sit closer. He leaned in, his face barely illuminated by the flickering streetlight outside the window. "I want you to be my messenger," he said softly. "Take this letter to the only person who might still remember Benjamin, his daughter." He paused, as if measuring the gravity of his request. "I believe she lives in the old farmhouse near the river. Find her. Give her the letter. Let her know that her father was brave, that he loved her more than life itself." The room was thick with the smell of old paper and unspoken regrets. Claire's mind churned with questions, yet she only nodded in silent agreement. She promised him then that she would do everything in her power to bring closure to a past that had long lingered in the shadowed corners of time. In the days that followed, every answer Harold provided was tinged with desperation and a yearning for redemption. He recounted his letters sent to addresses that no longer existed, his visits to abandoned hometowns where even the trees whispered stories of loss. He spoke of how the embers of hope had slowly dimmed in his heart over the years, replaced by the bitterness of regret. Yet, his voice sometimes softened when he spoke of Benjamin's laughter, a sound that seemed to echo from a time when life was filled with possibility and joy. One evening, after a particularly heart-wrenching session, Claire found herself alone with Harold as the setting sun cast long, sorrowful shadows across the room. The veteran's hands, gnarled by time and the scars of battle, gently traced the worn edges of an old photograph. It was a black and white image showing a group of young men in crisp uniforms, their faces lit with the innocence of youth and dreams unspoken. Benjamin's face stood out, a radiant smile that belied the horrors they had endured. Harold's eyes softened as he murmured, "He was the light in that darkness, the spark that kept us all believing that good could still conquer evil." Claire listened, her own eyes brimming with tears. The story spilled out in a torrent of emotion, each memory a drop of sorrow and a shard of hope. In that moment, she recognized that this was not just a tale of war and loss. It was a story of the human spirit. It was about the unyielding quest for meaning even when every promise seemed to fracture beneath the weight of time. Determined to honor Harold's request, Claire set out the next morning with the letter tucked safely in her bag. She embarked on a journey that took her through bustling city streets and quiet country roads. The trip felt symbolic, a bridge between generations, a quest to mend the fragmented legacy of a forgotten hero. As she traveled, she replayed every word Harold had spoken like a mantra, each recollection anchoring her resolve. Her journey was not merely physical but emotional. Each mile brought her closer to a time long past, yet more vivid in its raw humanity. She remembered the trembling urgency in Harold's voice, the unspoken pain in his eyes. With every step, the letter in her bag grew heavier with meaning. It was as if it carried not just ink on paper, but the weight of every promise made in the depths of despair. Days passed, and Claire finally arrived at the outskirts of a small town skirted by wildflowers and meandering streams. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a crumbling lane, its white paint faded and windows clouded with the residue of endless seasons. It was quiet silence laden with secrets and memories that had long been buried beneath layers of time. Inside the farmhouse, an elderly woman named Evelyn greeted her with cautious eyes and a gentle smile. Evelyn's face bore the soft lines of a life well lived, yet marked by sorrow that only a parent can know. "You must be Claire," she said, her voice unsteady but kind. "I was told you would come." In the modest living room, with its threadbare curtains and faded floral wallpaper, Claire presented the envelope to Evelyn. As the old woman's hands held the fragile letter, there was a moment of deep, unspoken understanding. Evelyn's eyes grew misty as she carefully broke the seal. The room filled with a heavy quiet, punctuated only by the soft rustling of paper and the murmurs of long-lost memories. The letter revealed Benjamin's final words. In his neat but trembling script, he had written of love, longing, and the desperate hope that someday his family would know how much he cherished every moment even in the heart of chaos. Evelyn read it slowly, her face transforming from reserved grief to a tender, almost joyful sorrow. In that moment, the decades of uncertainty and separation began to dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming surge of connection. Benjamin's spirit seemed to reach out from those faded lines, filling the small room with a bittersweet warmth. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest. "Your father was my world," she whispered. "I always wondered what his final thoughts were, what he wanted us to remember about him." As she spoke, Claire felt a profound empathy, a shared sorrow that spanned across time, bridging the gap between the living and those who had passed on. Outside, the wind picked up, as if echoing the emotions swirling within the farmhouse. The sky was a dim canvas of grays and blues, mirroring the mixture of melancholy and hope that now resonated in every corner of that humble home. Claire sat with Evelyn for hours, listening as the elderly woman recounted memories of her son, a vibrant, joyful child who had once filled the house with laughter. Each story was like a piece of a shattered mosaic slowly being reassembled, revealing a picture of love that had been lost to the ravages of time and war. Back in her hometown, Claire's recorder still held every whispered detail from Harold's interviews. Each story was a lesson in the resilience of the human spirit and a reminder that history was more than dates and medals. It was a tapestry woven from threads of heartache, courage, and unyielding hope. With every conversation, every tear, and every silent promise, Claire began to understand the profound duty she now carried. She was not just recording a veteran's memories. She was preserving the legacy of every forgotten hero whose sacrifices had been swept away by the tide of time. In the final days of her journey, as autumn turned to a chilly winter, Claire returned to Willow Pines with a sense of mission. She met Harold once more in that familiar, dimly lit room by the window. His eyes held a subdued radiance, as though seeing the fruits of his own long quest reflected in her determined gaze. "I delivered the letter," she said softly. His daughter, Evelyn, found solace in his words. "She said your story gave her a way to remember him the way he lived and loved." Harold's face, lined with the map of his life, broke into a fragile, smiling smile that mingled relief with the sorrow of years lost. "Then maybe I was not as lost as I feared," he replied. For the rest of the afternoon, as the two sat enveloped in the quiet hum of memories, the past and present danced together in gentle synchronicity. Claire felt a deep transformation within herself. She had come seeking a story for school, but had discovered a truth about the human condition, that every life is a repository of dreams, regrets, and above all, the enduring power of love. In that moment, the recorder was no longer just an instrument of capture. It had become a bridge connecting souls across the gulf of time and loss. Harold's final story, the one that had made her sob, was not an end but a new beginning, a chance to honor the sacrifices of a bygone era and to remind the world that even in the darkest of times, hope can bloom. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow that melted into the tender hues of twilight, Claire promised herself that she would carry these stories into the future. Every word recorded, every tear shed, and every silent vow made in that fragile room would live on, etched into the hearts of those who dared to remember. And so, with a heavy yet hopeful heart, She pressed record one final time, not to capture more voices, but to affirm that the legacy of love, loss, and redemption endures beyond the echoes of war. The soft hum of the recorder blended with the whispers of the past, forming a requiem for forgotten heroes and a hymn for those who continue to believe in the transformative power of truth. In the dim light of that fading day, as memories coalesced into a symphony of pain and hope, Claire realized that some stories must be told, even if they break the heart. For in each shattered promise, in every tear that fell like autumn rain, there lay the seeds of forgiveness and the promise of a future where the wounds of the past might finally begin to heal. Thus, the journey of a young girl and an old soldier intertwined, marking the end of one era and the tender birth of a Nathra legacy, recorded not in ink or stone, but in the quiet bravery of living, remembering, and ultimately forgiving. The last time Claire saw Harold Green alive, the sky outside his window was blooming in hues of pink and gold, as if the world itself was holding its breath. His breathing was slower, but steady. His hands, always shaking, were now still. And though his body seemed smaller, more fragile than ever, there was a strange peace about him. He opened his eyes when he heard her footsteps. "You came," he whispered. "I promised I would," she said, sitting beside him, gently placing a hand on the worn armrest of his wheelchair. "And I kept your promise, too." He gave a tired nod, his eyes brimming but too dry for tears. Was she like him? "She has his eyes," Claire whispered. She told me she remembered him playing guitar in the evenings. Said he smelled like cinnamon and pipe tobacco. She kept a picture of him by her bed all her life. Harold closed his eyes. "Good, that's good." Claire reached into her satchel and pulled out a photo, a copy Evelyn had given Harif Benjamin holding a baby, probably Evelyn herself, wrapped in a soft blanket. She placed it in Harold's hand. "I thought you should have this." His thumb brushed against the image. For a long while, he didn't say a word. Then, in the quiet that followed, he murmured, "Tell your teacher I hope you get an A." Claire laughed, softly, as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I think I've already gotten more than that." He looked at her, studied her face as if trying to memorize it, and said, "You're going to be the kind of person who carries people with you. Not in memory, but in action. You'll keep them alive that way." Then, for the first time since she met him, Harold reached out and took her hand in his. His grip was gentle. "You gave me peace, Claire. I didn't know that was still possible." She squeezed his hand back, not trusting her voice. In her silence, she said everything. That night, Harold Green passed away in his sleep. The nurse said he looked like a man who had finally set down a great weight. His funeral was simple, modest flag, a few old comrades from the veterans' home, and a reverent stillness in the air. Claire spoke briefly, recounting how she'd come for a school project and walked away with something like purpose. After the service, Claire stayed behind while the others left. She stood by his grave, tracing the letters of his name etched into the headstone. Then she whispered, "Thank you for trusting me. I won't forget." The weeks that followed weren't easy. Grief, she learned, was quiet and sneaky. It wasn't always a sob or a breakdown. It was seeing a scarf in a thrift store that looked like his, or hearing a gravelly laugh that reminded her of him. It was looking at the recorder and not knowing what to do with it. At school, her project presentation took the form of an audio documentary. No slides, no charts, just the voice of a man who had lived through history. Her teacher wept. The class listened in breathless silence. Claire ended the recording with a quote from Harold. "People always ask about what we did in the war. They should ask what we promised. That's where the real story is." The school published the piece in their online journal. Local media picked it up. Before long, Claire found herself being asked for interviews, not because she was a journalist or historian, but because she listened when it mattered most. One afternoon, weeks after the funeral, a letter arrived in Claire's mailbox. It was addressed in old, looping handwriting. To the young woman who remembered what others forgot. Inside was a card from Evelyn. It read, "My father was buried in silence. You gave him back his voice. I never imagined I would hear his words again, especially not from a stranger. You are not a stranger now. You are family. If ever you are in Vermont, the old farmhouse will always have a light on for you. With deepest thanks, Evelyn Sorensen." Tucked behind the letter was a photograph. Claire, sitting beside Harold by the window, both mid-laugh. She hadn't even known the photo had been taken. Someone at Willow Pines must have captured it. Claire framed it and placed it on her desk. By spring, Claire's life had changed. Not in some flashy, grand way. But in her heart, something had shifted. She began volunteering at Willow Pines every Saturday, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The residents weren't just elderly strangers anymore. They were vaults of stories, longing to be opened. She sat beside them, asked gentle questions, and listened. Sometimes they shared. Sometimes they didn't. And that was okay, too. She recorded them all with permission and started a podcast called Last Letters. Each episode was one story, a letter never sent, a conversation never had, a memory long buried. Her audience grew, slowly but steadily. What began as a school project became a lifeline for voices fading into silence. Her favorite episode, though, would always be the first one, Harold's. The summer after graduation, Claire took a train to Vermont. The farmhouse was just as she remembered it, between trees, the porch sagging under the weight of time, the wind carrying the scent of pine and honeysuckle. Evelyn greeted her with open arms. They sat on the porch and talked for hours. Evelyn shared more stories about Benjamin, how he used to whistle when he was nervous, how he carved her name into the barn wall when she was born, how he taught her to dance by placing her feet on his shoes and swaying to an old jazz record. Claire listened with the reverence of someone unearthing treasure. The stories, she realized, weren't about the war, they were about the people left behind, the echoes that linger long after the gunfire ends. That evening, Evelyn handed Claire something wrapped in a soft cloth. It was a small, hand-carved wooden box. "This belonged to my father," she said. "He made it in camp, during the war. He always kept his letters in it." Inside were a few more letters, unopened, addressed to Benjamin from family members. Claire didn't read them, those were for Evelyn. But she held the box like it was sacred, a bridge between generations forged in ink and devotion. "You helped give this back to me," Evelyn said quietly. "You didn't just deliver a letter. You delivered a part of my father I thought I'd never see again." Claire returned to her hometown with that box, her recorder, and a heart fuller than she'd ever known. She kept telling stories of love, loss, and letters never sent. And through it all, she carried Harold and Benjamin with her, not just in memory, but in purpose. Months later, the podcast had reached 100,000 downloads. Claire was invited to speak at universities and history conferences. She met with families who had listened to Harold's episode and decided to share their stories. A woman in Oregon who found her grandfather's World War II journal. A man in Tennessee who had written a goodbye letter to his brother but never sent it. The world, it seemed, was full of letters waiting to be heard. And though she was only 18, Claire had found what most spend their whole lives seeking, a calling rooted in truth, compassion, and bearing witness. In a quiet corner of her bedroom, by the framed photo of her and Harold, Claire kept a small shelf of letters, copies of every story she'd recorded. On the back of each envelope, she wrote one word: promise. Because that's what they were. Promises remembered. Promises honored. Promises kept. Autumn arrived quietly, brushing the trees outside Claire's window with shades of amber and rust. She had started college just a few weeks before, a small liberal arts school 2 hours from home, majoring in journalism and history. Her dorm room was modest, a twin bed, a cluttered desk, and the photo of her and Harold watching over it all like a silent guardian. Though her schedule was full: lectures, research papers, deadlines, Claire always made time for Last Letters. The podcast had taken on a life of its own. Each story felt like a doorway into someone else's past, and with each new voice, she was reminded that the world was not made of headlines or history books but of people. Fragile, complicated, beautiful people. One day, after a class on American wartime propaganda, her professor asked her to stay behind. "I listened to your podcast," he said, eyes sharp with curiosity. "You're doing more than just recording memories. You're giving people something they didn't know they lost." Claire didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to praise, not the kind that felt like it saw through her. He continued, "I want to sponsor an independent study with you. Something deeper. Oral histories from war survivors. Undocumented stories, especially those that never made it into the textbooks. We'll work with the library archive to preserve them." Claire blinked. "Are you serious?" "Deadly," he replied with a grin. "This work matters. You've already proven that." In December, she received a letter from a man in Montana named Jacob Rivera. His handwriting was shaky, the envelope smudged with age and effort. "Dear Claire, I heard your podcast by accident. My grandson played it in the truck. He listens to war stories. I don't. Not since Korea. But when I heard Harold's voice, I pulled over and cried for the first time in 50 years. He said what I couldn't. And I think maybe it's time I did, too. Would you come visit an old man who still remembers the cold of that mountain and the face of his best friend just before he died? I'd like to tell someone, before I forget completely. She wrote back that same night. A week later, she was sitting in a cabin nestled in the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by the smell of cedar and coffee. Jacob had a thick beard and watery eyes. His voice cracked often, but he spoke. For 3 hours, he told her about his best friend Luis, who had shielded him during a mortar attack. About how he'd carried Luis's dog tags ever since, unable to face Luis's parents after the war. About the guilt that lived in his bones. After the interview, Claire reached out to Luis's surviving relatives in New Mexico. They never knew how he died, only that he didn't come back. She recorded a letter from Jacob to the family, and with trembling hands, delivered it in person. The Rivera family cried as they listened, hugged her like she was one of their own. And for the first time in decades, Jacob slept through the night. By spring, Last Letters had reached 250,000 subscribers. But it wasn't the numbers that moved Claire, it was the people. Like Maria in Florida, who sent Claire a shoebox of letters her husband wrote during Vietnam, asking for help reading them aloud. Or Thomas, a quiet man in Boston, who mailed her a single envelope with the words, "For the daughter I never met." Each episode was like turning the key to a locked room, and inside, grief and love lived side by side, stubborn and sacred. But not all stories were old. One evening, Claire received a voice message from a young woman named Amina, a refugee from Syria. "I heard your story about Harold, and I wanted to tell you mine. I don't have a grave to visit. My father disappeared during the fighting, but he left behind a note, only one. I have never shared it out loud. Would you record it with me?" Claire flew to Michigan that weekend. In a quiet living room lit by warm lamplight, Amina read the note in Arabic, her voice strong but quivering. Claire read the translation, her own voice breaking halfway through. The note wasn't long, just a promise from a father to find his daughter again. A promise made in ink and hope, even as the bombs fell. The episode went viral. And suddenly, Claire found herself no longer just recording history but being part of a global chorus of remembrance. On her 19th birthday, Claire returned to Willow Pines. She walked through the halls slowly, stopping by rooms she once knew well. Some doors were open, some closed forever, but all of them had held lives that mattered. She sat for a while at Harold's old window, the one that overlooked the garden. A new resident, a woman in her 80s named Dorothy, was painting by the sunlight. She noticed Claire and smiled. "You knew Harold?" she asked. Claire nodded. "He was one of my first stories." Dorothy set down her brush. "He was a good man, quiet, but kind. Sometimes I think the kind ones carry the loudest memories." Claire smiled. "I think he'd like that." Dorothy glanced at her canvas. "Would you like to paint with me?" "I don't know how," Claire laughed. "You don't have to," Dorothy replied. "You just need to remember." That summer, Claire compiled her first book, Last Letters, Voices Between the Silencia collection of transcribed interviews, photos, and reflections. It was part memoir, part history, and fully human. Publishers called. Interviews followed. But Claire remained grounded. She wasn't chasing fame, she was following the echoes of people who'd waited too long to be heard. When the book was published, she dedicated it simply. "To Harold Green, who trusted me with the story he carried for 70 years. And to every soul still waiting to be heard. Your words matter. I'm listening." On the first anniversary of Harold's death, Claire returned to his grave. The sky looked just like it had that last day, pink and gold, stretched like a promise over the horizon. She knelt and placed a fresh copy of her book by the stone. Next to it, a folded letter. Inside, in her neat handwriting, she wrote, "Dear Harold, you were right. Promises are the real story. You gave me yours, and I gave mine. Thank you for trusting a teenager with your truth. Because of you, the world is a little less silent. I will keep listening. I will keep remembering. I will keep carrying you. Love, Claire." She stood, wiped her eyes, and whispered into the wind, "Rest easy, my friend. Your story didn't end. It just found another voice." And as she walked back toward the trees, the sunlight danced across the grass, soft, warm, and golden, like the world itself had heard her promise. End.